in 1561, Mary Stuart was about 20 when she arrived, as I say, back in Scotland. Her mother, Mary of Guise, had arranged when Mary Stuart was, I think, 4 or 5, to have her married to the Dauphin of France. This was the son of Francis I. They were both babies. And Mary Stuart was taken to France. So she grew up through her teen years in France. That's why she spoke 7 languages and was so highly cultivated and educated and all the rest of it. She was really a French princess. Her husband-to-be was Francis. Well, he came to the throne eventually, when he was about 17, I think, as Francis II. They, of course, did not consummate their marriage in those early years, and they were expected to by the time they were 16, but they didn't. And they hadn't consummated it, for all I know, at the time of his death. He died the following year after the marriage, after they came to the throne as king and queen consort. She was now the Dowager Queen of France at 18. But she had this mother-in-law from hell, Catherine de' Medici, crouched ready to spring, and Catherine sent her packing right away. Now, James V, the father of Mary Stuart, had long since passed away. Mary of Guise was acting as regent for her daughter. Her daughter was in France. Mary of Guise stayed in Scotland and presided over Scotland with a French army. And all of that was taken away when Francis died. Francis II died, and Mary Stuart was a dowager at 18. And Catherine de' Medici said, out you go. And back she went to Scotland without the French army. I'm getting to the point. So she was immediately confronted with John Knox, of blessed memory. And John Knox was about 46. He was a fanatical anti-Catholic. He was a follower and student of John Calvin, the one who actually made the Reformation move forward, as I said last month. And he was, of course, a bitter foe of Mary of Guise while she was still in Scotland. And now he was a foe of Mary Stuart, her daughter. It was just a rote thing. He hated them all. They were Catholics. Well, Knox was working to turn Scotland into a theocratic presbytery. He wanted a church-state relationship there. And a year before her arrival, he had declared the Kirk, which is a Presbyterian state church over all Scotland. He just declared this. He had a big following, so that's the way it went. Mary's arrival on the scene at the same time was just knocking his whole project galley west, and he resented the whole business. Well, he confronted her within 18 months. She took up residence in the Edinburgh Castle and her court and all the rest. She brought a priest or two with her from France and her other courtiers from France that she'd known, people all her life, her ladies in waiting, the rest of it, all of whom were seen as foreigners by the Scots, or at least the people of Knox's ilk. In that period of getting settled in and all, Knox was fuming. Well, finally, they confronted each other in church. Mary attended church, of course, and there was Knox in the pulpit screaming at her, "Whore of Babylon, this is the queen. This is the queen." All this terrible epithets and all this business right in front of the whole court and everybody. Well, Mary, she was a French princess, so she never flickered an eyelash, but it hurt her deeply, and she didn't know what to do, how to get around this awful man, in her view, awful man. And she never pushed her religion in public. He had no reason to castigate her so, as he was doing, but she couldn't do anything to mollify him. She sought his cooperation about a year later. Knox was busy raising the Western Scots against her in rebellion. And she said to him, if you will stop raising this rebellion against our crown, we will see to it that we will administer laws proscribing Catholics. That didn't mean you outlawed Catholics. That meant that the display of Catholicism would be removed from the public's view. The churches would be governed as Knox wanted them. people who were Catholic and devout would worship in their own homes as they wished. That was Mary's deal. Well, he wouldn't go for it. He absolutely refused. It didn't matter what she did. It didn't matter what she did. He wanted her out. He wanted her knocked over. And he rejected, of course, this conciliatory action. Well, there were factions growing around both of them. Both of them had supporters. She wasn't alone in the world. But Knox was gaining a lot more than she was. And it resulted in intermittent civil war. Religious factions warring against each other. Well, in her side of the argument, there were members of the nobility who felt that she should get married again, that she was not capable, I guess that's right, not capable of ruling without a strong man at her side. And so they selected, the selection is hard to divine how it came about. Even Elizabeth I was involved in this. But the man who was put forward for Mary Stuart to marry was Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. They were distant cousins, obviously. He was very handsome. He was, I think, a year, 18 months younger than she. Very prepossessing in his appearance, but it was a dreadful choice. He was indeterminate about his sexuality, for one thing, which led to embarrassments. She was not a very good judge of men, and she found him beautiful and attractive and happily wed him, and they cohabited, and she became pregnant. Well, Darnley was a pushover for, well, he was a bully, so he was a coward. And the Earl of Moray and several other people within the court circle who were apparently drifting over to Knox's side of things wanted to render Mary without any support of any kind, even in her own household. And one of the people she'd brought with her from Europe was a young man named Rizzio. He was a very attractive young Italian, about her age, who was very well read, very gifted musician, a charming man. He acted as her secretary and companion. There was nothing physical. It was just a companionship. She loved him, he loved her. Well, he might have wanted more, but he knew his place. And he was around her all the time, involved in everything she did. And the Scots resented him. He was a double foreigner. He was an Italian. So they wanted to embarrass the queen, so they cooked up a plot to destroy Rizzio. And they got Darnley to sort of be the cat's paw. And Darnley went along with it. He was jealous. He didn't love his wife, but he was jealous of the fact that Mary found greater surcease with Rizzio than she did with him. Not hard to understand if you knew Darnley. He was such an ass. But anyway, these earls and Darnley burst into her apartments in the Edinburgh Castle while she was dining and dragged Rizzio into the hall and eviscerated him right in front of her. She was 3 months pregnant. Oh, well, this was a terrible thing for her, of course. Her son was born a few months later. She named him James after her father. And then, of course, she had to face all of this misery alone now without her friend. Well, Darnley was hated by everybody because he was such a slimy toad. Beautiful as he may have been, he was still a toad. Everybody disliked him. Well, he either caught the clap or smallpox, it's hard to tell which, but he broke out in pustules, so they sent him to the countryside to get well, and the queen was separated from him for, I don't know, several months it seemed. Well, finally he was well enough to return to her, and so he made his entry, or started to make his entry to Edinburgh. She went out to meet him and said, no, let's do this tomorrow. So he stayed in Kirkefields that night. It was a big farmhouse out in the outskirts of Edinburgh. In the middle of the night, Kirkefield blew up. Somebody put gunpowder in it, blew up the building. And Darnley was found dead in the garden. He didn't blow up. Somebody had stabbed him to death. So, my goodness, it got very exciting. Everybody knew who had engineered this, they thought. And that was the Earl of Bothwell. Now, Bothwell had come into the picture even before Rizzio's death, as a supporter of Mary Stuart, and then a lover, because she obviously had no love relationship with her husband. Well, Bothwell was suspected of having designed the murder of Darnley. It wasn't, I think it was 2 months later, he married Mary Stuart. She was now a widow twice, and it was perfectly legitimate. He'd been married, I don't know, 4 times. Who forgot to count? I don't know, but he had a very checkered career. You see, I told you she was a dummy when it came to men. It was sort of sad because she was so gifted, and so beautiful, so charming, and so exquisite in so many ways, but she was an absolute dunce when it came to judgment about men. Well, anyway, they got married, and he led an army to suppress the John Knox crowd and put down. He was not up to it. He may have been personally, but he couldn't gather and organize and keep in the field an army sufficient to really cement her throne in place. And his army was defeated, and he fled the country. And she was taken captive, placed in Lochleven Castle, and she abdicated. She abdicated in the name of her baby son, James, who became James VI of Scotland. He's around the corner here. Of course, the Civil War raged. Her followers didn't disappear simply because she had abdicated or was in prison, but it raged on until 68, when she managed to escape Lochleven Castle and with a couple of servants fled across the border into England. Well, now she became Elizabeth's problem. Immediately, Elizabeth's counselors said, kill her. Execute her right now, first thing. Oh, no. And then John Knox wrote across the border to Queen Elizabeth, execute Mary Stuart. Everybody wanted Mary Stuart dead, except Elizabeth. She said, no, we can't do that. It would set a precedent. Monarchs who flee to the other monarchs for safety and help, you don't execute them. This is bad. What if that happened to me? So she put it off and dithered over this thing. And her ministers were going crazy. She dithered for 15 years. She did not want to do this thing. And Mary Stuart was moved around from prison to prison all that time. Every time she was moved to a special house of detention, her jailer or custodian or whatever you want to call him fell in love with her. Well, she was a charmer. And of course, then they'd move her to another place where she had less reception. Well, she was implicated in those years in half a dozen plots against Elizabeth. At least that's the way they were staged. William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, was her chief minister, and then the Earl of Walsingham was her secretary or minister of police. And these two men worked together, and they surrounded Mary Stuart with spies the whole time, trying to get something on her that they could prove that she was a villain, and then they could proceed to prosecute her. Well, it didn't work out too well. By 1572, they uncovered the Spanish plot. There was no real evidence, and that fell apart. Then in 81, almost a decade later, Mary Stuart was in prison all this time, wandering around. The French plot was discovered. Of course, that was the work of Catherine de Medici. Oh, the villainess of the world. She actually was a very nice woman. I remember her well. But, history tells a different story. But they couldn't prove anything that connected Mary Stuart to it. So that dropped through the bottom. But then came the Babington plot. Now, that was a plot to directly murder Queen Elizabeth. And they thought they had evidence for that in the form of the casket letters. This may have been trumped up by Lord Walsingham. He may have written them himself, who knows. But these letters were supposed to be the private secret correspondence of Mary Stuart and her agents abroad, in which it was clear, if the letters were genuine, she and Bothwell had engineered the murder of Darnley. She and Bothwell. So that was good. That was great evidence. Get her for that. And that they were plotting the murder of Elizabeth while she was at the final years of her time in Scotland, while Mary Stuart was. So this was what they used to trump up a trial which they held at Fotheringay Castle. She was moved to Fotheringay in the 86, I guess it was. The trial was held there, and she was convicted of treason and sentenced to die by beheading. And the death warrants was placed, of course, before the Queen, Elizabeth, who said, well, the evidence is there, and I will initial this, but I will finally sign it when I'm ready. And you're not to do anything until I am ready. Is that understood? Oh, Majesty, of course. Yes, Majesty, of course. So they whisked away the document to Fotheringay Castle, and a month later they executed Mary Stuart without any consent from Elizabeth. Now, the execution of Mary Stuart was one of those great media events. People came from all over to report. I don't mean the television came, but Fox News was there. And so they wanted to see this. Nobody done this. I can't think of any other monarchs executing each other. The execution was terribly dramatic. It's been the subject for dramas and movies, and it would be fun. We don't have time to go through the whole thing, but with the hair coming off, the little dog and the blood, and the 3 whacks to get the head loose, and it was just so exciting. Well, anyway, Mary Stuart was executed, and when Elizabeth heard this, she dared do it. It was done. It was a done deal. Mary Stuart was gone. Thank goodness. Well, the next year, there was an international incident. There were rebellions of Catholics supposedly rebelling because of the execution of Mary Stuart. And that was something that the public was focused on when the news came of the Spanish Armada headed for England. Now, this is the big issue. Philip II over here, had launched this armada in revenge for England's interference with her annual spring bullion fleet, which left Cuba in the spring on the tides, sailed back to Spain, loaded down with gold and silver, raped out of the New World. This is what's paying for all of the Spanish Empire. And the British, Queen Elizabeth gave patents to all manner of pirates. She got a percentage, I think it was 7%, went to the crown, and they got the rest. They had investors, of course. And they went out and they would attack these bullion fleets. Well, of course, Spain couldn't afford to have that done. And the other thing was that the English were interfering with the occupation invasion of the Netherlands by the Spanish. Now, that's 20 miles away across the channel for the English. But it's all the way from Spain up through the English Channel and into the Netherlands for the Spanish. They couldn't go overland through Europe. This was a big undertaking for the Spanish. They were hanging on to the Netherlands, which was Holland and Belgium, if you want to call it something. And this area of Europe was turning Protestant. But this was an integral part of the Holy Roman Empire and now of the Spanish Empire. And Philip wasn't about to give it up. He was investing billions in keeping this thing. So it was terribly important that the damned English butt out of it. Well, they weren't. So the Spanish Armada approached England. Well, it arrived up the channel. It was very complicated. The whole thing went awry to begin with. It was a huge fleet of ships. England didn't have any navy, but they did have Drake and Frobisher and Howard and their little fleets. And they knew how to sail the seas. They'd been up, they were the pirates, or the pirateers, sorry, who'd been doing all this thing. So they sailed out to meet them, and the passage of the Spanish fleet up the channel and the whole thing took better than a week, maybe 2 weeks, because they had to stop at the mainland and regroup and then head out again to England. And it all went to pieces. They sent fire ships into the Spanish fleet, which the Spanish moored their ships close together. Of course, that was a bad tactic when the fire ships got in there. Everything went wrong. Then the weather descended on them. A freak hurricane. We don't have hurricanes in the Channel. Blew up the English Channel and dispersed what was left of the Spanish fleet. They sailed around above England through Scotland around the Hebrides, came down, landed in Ireland, fornicated like crazy. That's why we have all the beautiful black-haired, blue-eyed Irish. and 6 out of 1,000 are reached Spain again. You know, it was just a total disaster for Philip. He sent out 2 other armadas. Nobody ever talks about them. They didn't get anywhere either. But the fact that this had happened meant that England saw itself as victorious. You notice how many disasters we suffer and we say it's a victory? Same idiocy then as now. Well, Elizabeth everybody went to the coast during the Armada's approach. Everybody was there. She was there in a breastplate with her sword on her horse. Oh, the English loved this, with the bonfires up and down the coast, Dover all up on the bluffs there. Oh my God, it was a scene. Waiting for the invasion, which never came. And now she was the victorious monarch, and celebrations and everything. But this all went sour when she refused to pay the sailors. Can you believe it? She was so stingy. I don't know whether she was stingy or whether the exchequer had been over-credited with more than they had, but she didn't pay them, and this soured her reputation somewhat. Well, by the 1590s, Elizabeth had definitely outlived her time. All her old friends and supporters, Lord Burleigh, Lord Walsingham, Lord Dudley, whom she loved and adored, had died years before. They were all dead. She was the old monarch with a young court, all their children and grandchildren were now her courtiers. And there was this continuous religious strife. This was so difficult. One little rebellion after another that had to be put down, and sometimes with a lot of ugliness. She had a parliament. Remember, under Henry VIII, when he had bought a new parliament, Lords and Commons, and they were very quiescent. This was now a generation and a half, maybe 2 generations later. And these new, at least the House of Commons, had all of the independence and good feeling about their position as Parliament that they'd inherited from her father's time, but they didn't have any of the fealty to Elizabeth that their forefathers had had to Henry. So they were very independent, sort of pushy, and pushed back on her decisions, and this was difficult for her. But I suppose the most emotionally difficult thing for her at the last was her relationship with Robert Devereux, the 2nd Earl of Essex. But they were in the middle of a stormy 14-year relationship. There was 35 years difference in their ages. She first met him for good and all when he was about 20. She was 55, I think, something like that. She was just taken by him, and he was a charmer. He was a charmer. He obviously saw that she found him attractive. Well, that isn't surprising. And he made the most of his physical charms, his attributes. But underneath, he was greedy, ambitious, and arrogant. And this frequently came out. They had awful arguments. They confronted each other time and time again through these 14 years. But he took advantage of her affection for him, no question. She was deeply committed to him in her heart. Well, the aggravations of this relationship finally spun out in 1599. She'd always given him everything he wanted. He wanted military glory. She gave him commands and armies and money to work, and so it usually came to naught, but he could do no harm in her eyes. Well, the Irish were raising hell, as they should, and the Earl of Tyrone, who was a huge popular hero in Ireland, was trying to repel the English, from Ireland. And this had been going on for decades, the Irish trying to resist English inroads. And so they had to find a commander of an army to go and settle this issue. And Essex screamed and yelled the house down until he was given the command by Elizabeth over her ministers, who said, "Oh, please don't give him an army." "No, he'll do it. He's fine. You just don't understand the boy." Well, off he went with the army to fit the Battle of the Irish. The ministers went to work immediately on Elizabeth. "He is going to ruin you. He is undermining your reign. He's going to destroy us all." "Oh, nonsense," she said. Well, in the meantime, they were sending him, Essex, contradictory orders. They were interrupting his supply line, and he caught on. He was not stupid. He caught on immediately as to what was happening, and without orders to do so, he returned to England with the army. And he marched on London. When the court and the monarch and the ministers saw that he was approaching London, the ministers said, well, now you see, this is what we've been warning you about. He's come to kill us all. We've tried to keep you, and now you've done it. Well, he wouldn't do this, she said. Well, he didn't march into London with his army. He left the army in the outskirts and came in alone with a couple of servants. And, he was hugely well known. Everybody knew of the Earl of Essex and his great power as the special favorite of the Queen. So everybody recognized him and nobody stopped him. You never knew whether he was in or out with the Queen. If he was in and you made some mess of it, your head might roll. So everybody stood aside. He barged right into her private apartments, and he burst in on her, unannounced. There is a state of affairs when a venerable lady does not want to be seen by her juvenile lover without her teeth, her hair, her eyes, her corsets, and in her bath. And this is how he found her. And she was furious. Well, he had a row. And at one point, he was so mad, he almost raised his hand to her. And she shouted, "Guard, guard!" Well, the guards were there, and they came right in. "Arrest him! Take him to the tower." She was just... Well, off he went to the tower, but he was suffering Tyrone's revenge. So she allowed him to go home and get cured. Montezuma's revenge? Tyrone's revenge. It works the same. Essex was a married man. He had children. He went to his townhouse, and while he was recovering, he started a negotiation, in quotes, with James VI of Scotland, who was thought by the Royal Council and the House of Lords to be the obvious successor to Elizabeth. She hadn't agreed to this, but that was the way everybody was thinking. Telling James, Essex was, that Essex had control of London and he was going to overthrow this old queen and pave the way for James to come in and take the throne. Well, James was no fool either. He did not respond to this. On the other hand, Essex went ahead with his rebellion, tried to raise the city of London against the Queen. Now, he had a dozen or so young idiots like himself who wanted to have a fight and a tussle, and they thought they could do it, and, all that sort of thing, hotheads. And they had a lot of, subsidiary characters that would support them, but nothing like a rebellion. And the city of London said, "Nonsense. She's our queen and always will be." And the royal guards had no trouble suppressing Essex rebellion. It collapsed, and he was seized. His Confederates, some of them were hanged. He was ordered to the Tower to face charges of treason, and there he stayed. He was convicted, and the death warrant placed before the Queen. Oh. Well, she couldn't bring herself to sign it. She still had this feeling for him. Some of you have imbecile sons, and you love them. You can't help they're imbeciles, but you love them. She didn't feel motherly about him, but, I'm trying to give something you can connect with. Or those of you ladies who do have young lovers, I'll address you. How would you? Well, finally, the ministers got frantic. They said, "You have to have him executed." "Oh, I can't. You know what he's saying about you." "Oh, he's not saying anything." "Yes, he is." "You know what he said?" "We have witnesses." "Oh, what did he say?" "He said, you're an old, disgusting wreck of a woman. He hates you. He thinks you're ugly. He's never loved you." He didn't say. "He did, madam. He did." "He said that?" "Yes." "Give me the warrant." She signed it. 24 hours later, he was led to Tower Green. Here was a man who was as popular as an astronaut is today. 34 years old. The height of his career, as far as the public knew. And there he was, beheaded. Well, Elizabeth was distraught. She was so emotionally shaken she could hardly breathe for a week. But by 1602, going on 1603, she was now feeling very much the old person. She was ill. And the last thing she had to face was the ministers constantly saying, you must sign the name into the act of succession of your successor. She, of course, was childless. So finally she did. She signed in the name of James VI of Scotland, that damned Mary Stuart's brat. In mid-1603, she moved the court up to Richmond. The air was better. One day, she collapsed right on the floor. Everybody rushed to pick her up. She said, leave me alone. They wanted to take her to bed. No, I don't want to go to bed. Bed meant death. And she lay there for 24 hours. The court knew she was dying. The grandees came to her, knelt down, kissed her hand, bade her farewell. She was no longer speaking. And in the wee hours of the morning, Queen Elizabeth died. She was only 70, but she looked older. We know her as Gloriana. She was the symbol of her age, the Virgin Queen. The Tudors had unwittingly moved England toward a constitutional monarchy. When Henry VIII, with his arbitrary policies, opened England to Protestantism, Protestantism has inherent in it democratic principles. And that's what Henry opened his government to, democratic principles. The seizure of the church properties, of course, gave huge new wealth to the merchant class. And there had been very little middle class in societies until this time. But now they were growing. Parliament was filled with this merchant class. And so there was a strong middle class movement growing in England. Very important, especially in the House of Commons. And as I said, Henry justified all his actions as being patriotic. And Elizabeth, his daughter, I assume from what I've read, felt the same way about her own actions. It was the good of the country she was doing. But the result, Parliament was independent now, or more so than it ever had been. Middle-class Protestantism had prevailed, it was powerful in the land. Trade, exploration, and a growing navy had made England a world power. And the monarch of England would soon be in real conflict with his own parliament. Slapped Burley across the face. Damn you! And he said, yes, ma'am. Executed. Well, and she turned to her maids of honor and said, oh, thank God that's over. What a pain in the ass she's been. You know. Well, Elizabeth knew how to put on a show. And she'd wanted to do it, but she didn't